He is everything she despises. She is everything he is unworthy of. Between them lies a chasm of prejudice and a trial that could never be fair. The silence of the Ministry of Magic at 2 a.m. was not peaceful. It was heavy. It pressed against the eardrums, a suffocating weight composed of unsaid words, buried secrets, and the ancient, dusty hum of the archives. Here, far below the bustling atrium, the air smelled of stale parchment, drying ink, and the metallic tang of cooling wax. Hermione Granger sat behind a desk that felt too large, surrounded by towers of files that felt too precarious. The only light came from a floating orb of bluebell flames she had conjured hours ago, casting long, wavering shadows against the stone walls. The light caught the golden lettering on the thick folder directly in front of her. Malfoy, D. She stared at the name. It was just ink on paper, yet it seemed to pulse with a dark, rhythmic heat. As the lead investigator appointed by the Wizengamot, Hermione was the architect of the post-war reckonings. She was the scalpel meant to separate the redeemable from the irredeemable. She had spent months dissecting the lives of Death Eaters, analyzing their crimes with cold, arithmetical precision. But this file was different. This file breathed. She ran a finger over the edge of the parchment. Her skin was dry, her cuticles ragged from nervous picking. She hadn't slept properly in weeks. The war was over, the battlements of Hogwarts were rebuilt, and the dead were buried. But the war inside her head, the war of categorization, of justice versus vengeance, raged on. A soft knock echoed through the stone chamber. It was a polite, restrained sound, utterly at odds with the violent memories associated with the man standing on the other side. "Enter," she said. Her voice sounded thin, swallowed by the vastness of the room. She cleared her throat and straightened her spine, pulling the mask of the High Inquisitor over her exhaustion. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Draco Malfoy stepped into the pool of blue light. He was not the boy she remembered. The sneer that used to twist his features into a permanent expression of disdain was gone, smoothed away by a terrifying blank neutrality. He was thinner, sharper. The expensive, billowing robes of his youth had been replaced by a simple, structured black suit devoid of family crests or silver pins. He looked like a sketch drawn in charcoal. Grey eyes, pale skin, dark shadows hollowed out beneath his cheekbones. He did not look at the room. He did not look at the exit. He looked straight at her. "Granger," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of reality. His voice was rough, as if he hadn't used it in days. "Mr. Malfoy," Hermione replied, gesturing to the wooden chair opposite her desk. "Sit." He moved with a fluid, silent grace that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. There was no swagger, no taking up space. He sat, folded his hands in his lap, and waited. He was perfectly still. It was the stillness of a statue, or perhaps a prey animal hoping to be mistaken for stone. Hermione opened the file. The sound of the paper turning was deafening in the quiet. "We are entering the final phase of the investigation regarding the Malfoy estate and your personal involvement in the events of the last 2 years," Hermione began, her tone practiced, professional. She refused to look him in the eye, focusing instead on the bridge of his nose. "My report will determine the Wizengamot sentencing next month. You understand the gravity of this interview?" I understand that my life is in your hands, Draco said softly. Hermione paused. She looked up, expecting sarcasm. She found none. His grey eyes were clear, terrifyingly lucid. He wasn't challenging her authority. He was accepting her power over him with a resignation that unsettled her more than any insult could have. "This isn't about power, Mr. Malfoy. It's about truth," she corrected, feeling a flash of irritation. She didn't want his submission. She wanted his accountability. "They are often the same thing," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the quill in her hand. Hermione dipped the quill into the inkwell, the glass clicking sharply. "Let's begin with the night of the astronomy tower. Your testimony has been inconsistent regarding your initial orders." "It hasn't been inconsistent, Granger. It has been incomplete." "Then complete it." Draco shifted slightly. The wood of the chair groaned. He looked at his hands, long, pale fingers that had once held a wand aimed at Dumbledore. "I cannot complete it without implicating people who are already dead. Is that what the Ministry wants? To put ghosts on trial?" "The Ministry wants to know if you were a willing participant or a tool," Hermione pressed, leaning forward. The candlelight flickered, casting the shadow of her curls across her face. "There is a difference, Draco. A difference that decides Azkaban or probation." He flinched. It was microscopic, a tightening of the jaw, a slight flare of the nostrils. But she saw it. She had used his first name. It was a slip, a crack in her professional armor. "A tool," he repeated, tasting the word. He looked up again, and for a second the mask slipped. She saw the exhaustion mirroring her own. She saw a deep, corroding guilt that looked like bruises behind his eyes. "A knife is a tool, Granger, but it still cuts. Does it matter if the hand holding it was shaking?" Hermione felt a sudden lack of air in the room. This was not the conversation she had prepared for. She had prepared for lies, for arrogant justifications, for the Malfoy pride to flare up like a defensive shield. She was prepared to fight. She was not prepared to be disarmed by honesty. "It matters," she whispered, her voice losing its judicial edge. "Intent matters." "My intent was to survive," he said simply, "and to keep my mother alive. If that condemns me, then write it down." He nodded toward her parchment. Hermione didn't write. Her quill hovered over the paper, the ink pooling at the tip, threatening to drip. She watched him. He was sitting in the center of a storm of his own making, yet he seemed oddly anchored. He wasn't begging. He wasn't trying to charm her. He was offering her the jagged pieces of his conscience and daring her to cut herself on them. "You're not making this easy," she said, finally lowering the quill. "I have no influence left to trade, Granger. No gold the Ministry hasn't frozen. No names to sell that aren't already in the papers." He leaned forward, just an inch, entering her personal space across the desk. The scent of him reached her. Rainwater, old parchment, and something sharp, like cedar. "All I have is the truth. And the truth is, I don't expect you to save me." "I'm not trying to save you," she snapped, defensive now. "I am trying to do my job." "Are you?" Draco tilted his head. His eyes scanned her face, dissecting her. He looked at the dark circles under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hand holding the quill, the way her robes hung loosely on her frame. "You look like you're haunting this place, Granger. When was the last time you went home?" Hermione stiffened. "That is irrelevant." "Is it?" His voice dropped, becoming a low timbre that vibrated in the stone floor. "You're dissecting my life to find a monster, but you're killing yourself to do it. Is that justice?" "Stop it," she warned, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was crossing the line. He was stepping out of the prisoner's box and standing beside her. "I'm just observing," he said, retreating into his stillness, his hands unclasping and resting flat on the table. "You asked for the truth. The truth is, I was a coward. I was terrified, and I broke things that can never be fixed." He paused, his gaze locking onto hers, holding her there in the blue light. "But I never wanted you dead. Not really. Not when it mattered." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the heavy silence of the archives anymore. It was a charged, electric silence. The air between them felt thick, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. Hermione felt a flush rise up her neck. It was a confession, but not a legal one. It was personal. It was an intimacy she hadn't asked for and didn't know how to categorize. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the boy who had watched her be tortured in his drawing room. But she also saw the man who had lowered his wand. The grey of his eyes was not cold. It was turbulent, like the sea before a storm. "The interview is over for tonight," Hermione said abruptly, closing the file. Her hands were shaking. She needed him to leave. She needed the air to return to normal. Draco stood up slowly. He didn't argue. He smoothed the front of his jacket, his movements deliberate. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "Yes," she breathed. He turned to the door, his hand resting on the brass handle. He hesitated. For a moment, she thought he would say something else, something to shatter the fragile tension. But he didn't. He simply looked back at her over his shoulder, a look that stripped away her title and her badge, seeing only the woman beneath. "Try to sleep, Granger," he said quietly. "The dead can wait." Then he was gone. The door clicked shut, and Hermione was alone. The bluebell flame flickered violently, as if caught in a draught. She stared at the empty chair where he had sat. The room felt colder without him. She looked down at her parchment. A single drop of ink had fallen from her quill, staining the page right next to his name. It looked like a tear, black and permanent. Hermione let out a breath she felt she had been holding for an hour. She touched the spot where he had sat, the wood still faintly warm. She realized then, with a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, that the danger wasn't that Draco Malfoy was a monster. The danger was that he wasn't, and she had to judge him anyway. The rain against the enchanted window pane did not tap. It drummed, a relentless, rhythmic assault that seemed intent on washing the Ministry of Magic into the sewers of London below. Inside Interrogation Room 4, the storm was a dull grey roar that swallowed the silence, insulating them from the rest of the world. Room 4 was smaller than the archives. It was sterile, the walls lined with sound-dampening wards that made the air feel thick, like walking through water. There were no stacks of paper to hide behind tonight. There was only a sleek metal table, 2 chairs, and the heavy, humid scent of ozone and wet wool. Hermione sat with her back to the window. She could feel the chill of the glass radiating through her robes, seeping into her spine. Across from her, Draco Malfoy was studying the grain of the table as if it held the secrets of the universe. He had rolled up the sleeves of his white shirt to his elbows, a small concession to the stifling heat of the room, exposing the dark mark. It was faded now, an ugly, mottled bruise against his pale skin, but Hermione's eyes kept snagging on it. It was impossible not to look. It was the physical manifestation of everything that stood between them. "We need to clarify the timeline of the 6th year," Hermione said. Her voice was steady, but she felt a strange vibration in her chest, a resonance with the storm outside. Specifically, the repair of the vanishing cabinet. Draco didn't look up. His finger traced a scratch on the metal surface. "I would have thought you'd be tired of that cabinet, Granger. It's been dismantled. The object is gone. The intent remains relevant." She shuffled the parchment in front of her, the sound sharp and dry against the humid air. "According to the testimony of Borgin, you were sending him instructions. He claims he was guiding you through the process, that you were struggling to comprehend the complexity of the harmonizing charm." Draco's head snapped up. The movement was so sudden, so sharp, that Hermione flinched. A spark of genuine indignation flared in his grey eyes, cutting through the dull resignation he had worn like a cloak the night before. "Borgin is a hack," Draco spat, the words biting. "He sells cursed necklaces to tourists. He wouldn't know a harmonizing charm if it strangled him. He wasn't guiding me. I was correcting him." Hermione paused, her quill hovering. This was new. Pride. The arrogant boy from school was still in there, buried under layers of trauma. "You're saying you repaired a connection between two spatially displacement objects through the Hogwarts wards without assistance?" "I'm saying," Draco leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "that the spellwork required to bridge the void between those two cabinets wasn't standard dark magic. It was arithmancy, pure theoretical arithmancy. Borgin wanted to use a brute force binding spell. If I had listened to him, the first person who stepped through that cabinet would have been splinched into atoms." Hermione stared at him. She was the brightest witch of her age. She knew the theory he was describing. It was incredibly advanced, unstable magic. To attempt it at 16, in isolation, under the threat of death. "You used a harmonic resonance instead," she realized aloud, the pieces clicking together in her mind. "You anchored it to the castle's own ley lines, so the wards wouldn't reject the connection." Draco looked at her, and the anger in his eyes shifted into something else. Surprise? Recognition? For a moment, the interrogation room fell away. They weren't prosecutor and defendant. They were two academic rivals, two intellects that had always circled each other in the classroom, finally meeting on the same plane. "Yes," he said softly. The defensive hunch of his shoulders relaxed. "I had to calculate the vibrational frequency of the castle. It took me 4 months just to get the math right." "That's why the birds died," Hermione murmured, the horror of the memory mixing with a reluctant, dark admiration for the skill involved. "The frequency was off. The first one died because the transition was too fast," Draco corrected, his voice devoid of emotion now, clinical. The second one lived for 10 minutes after it came back, but its mind was gone. I hadn't accounted for the psychological impact of the void." He looked at his hands then, the hands that had cast the spells. Hermione watched his fingers curl into fists. She saw the tremor again, the fine shaking that he tried so hard to suppress. "I fixed the math," he whispered. "I fixed it, and I let them in." The atmosphere in the room shifted. The intellectual connection snapped, replaced by the crushing weight of the consequence. The rain lashed harder against the glass, a chaotic percussion. Hermione felt a sudden, piercing pang of empathy that she tried to squash immediately. He was talking about enabling a massacre. She shouldn't be impressed by his arithmancy, but she was. She was looking at the boy who had been her tormentor and realizing that he was also her equal. Perhaps the only person who could truly understand the burden of being the smartest person in the room, even when that room was a prison of one's own making. "I need to note this," Hermione said, her voice sounding too loud in the intimate quiet. "The report says you were a passive tool, but you weren't passive, Draco. You were active, you were brilliant, and that makes it worse." "I know," he said. He didn't flinch at the praise or the condemnation. He accepted both as facts. Hermione dipped her quill. "I can frame it as coercion. Borgin's testimony—" "Don't." The word was a command. Hermione looked up, startled. Draco was staring at her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "Don't use Borgin's lies to make me look like a victim, Granger. I don't want his pity, and I don't want yours." "It's not pity," she argued, frustration bubbling up. "It's strategy. If I can prove you were incompetent and merely following orders, the sentence is lighter. Why are you fighting me on this?" "Because it's not true." He stood up, the chair screeching against the floor. He paced to the window, turning his back to her, looking out at the grey washout of the storm. "I spent a year of my life on that cabinet. I lost my mind on that cabinet. It was the only thing I had control over. If you take that away, if you write down that I was just a stupid boy doing what he was told, then it was all for nothing. The fear, the sickness, the birds, it has to mean something." Hermione watched his reflection in the dark glass. He looked ghostly, fading into the rain. She understood then. It wasn't about pride. It was about agency. He would rather be punished for his brilliance than forgiven for his incompetence. He needed to own his sins because they were the only things he had left. She stood up too. She didn't know she was going to do it until she was moving. She walked around the table, stopping a few feet behind him. She could smell the rain on him, a cold, clean scent that masked the smell of the fear-dampened room. "Draco," she said. He didn't turn. His shoulders were rigid. "I won't write that you were incompetent," she said quietly to his back. "I will write that you were a prodigy working under duress. I will write that you solved a problem that would have baffled fully qualified wizards." He turned then, slowly. The distance between them was negligible. In the small, dim room, the air felt charged, heavy with the unsaid. She could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the way his eyelashes cast shadows on his cheekbones. He looked exhausted, brittle, like porcelain that had been glued back together and might shatter at the slightest touch. "Why?" he asked. His voice was rough. "Because it's the truth," she echoed his words from the previous night. He looked at her, searching her face for a trap. He looked at her mouth, then up to her eyes. There was a moment, a fleeting, terrifying moment, where the history between them dissolved. There was no blood status, no war, no judge and jury. Just two people standing in a storm, recognizing the loneliness in each other. Hermione felt a pull, a magnetic drag toward him that defied all logic. She wanted to reach out and touch the arm with the dark mark, to feel the skin that had been branded, to verify that he was real and not just a ghost haunting her files. Draco took a breath. It was shaky. He took a half step toward her, or maybe he just swayed. "You are dangerous, Granger," he murmured. "I'm the prosecutor," she reminded him, though her voice lacked any bite. "No." He shook his head slightly, his gaze intense, pinning her to the spot. "You listen. No one listens. They just wait for their turn to speak. You actually hear me." The intimacy of the statement was shocking. It was more vulnerable than if he had cried. Hermione felt a flush rise from her chest to her cheeks. She stepped back, instinctively retreating to the safety of professional distance. The table dug into her lower back. We are done for today," she stammered, grabbing her files with hands that felt clumsy. Draco didn't move. He stayed by the window, watching her retreat. The mask was back in place, but it was thinner now, transparent. "Good night, Hermione," he said. She froze at the door. He hadn't called her Granger. The sound of her name on his tongue was foreign, illicit, and strangely right. It hung in the air, vibrating against the sound of the rain. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She fled the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind her, sealing him back inside the grey silence. Out in the corridor, the ministry was bustling with the shift change, noise and light and normalcy. But Hermione stood with her back against the cold stone wall, clutching the file to her chest, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked down at her notes. She had crossed out coerced incompetence and written extraordinary aptitude applied under extreme psychological pressure. She was saving his dignity, she told herself. That was all. It was just accuracy. But as she walked toward the lifts, the memory of his eyes, grey, stormy, and seeing her with a clarity that stripped her bare, burned in her mind. She wasn't just investigating a crime anymore. She was mapping a soul. And the terrifying part was that the map was starting to look familiar. Malfoy Manor did not look like a home. It looked like a mausoleum built for the living. Hermione stood at the foot of the grand staircase, her ministry-issued clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield. The air here was different than in London. It was thinner, colder, and smelled of centuries-old wax, damp stone, and the metallic tang of fading dark magic. The silence was absolute. It wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of a place holding its breath, waiting for the next blow. "The library is this way," Draco said. His voice didn't echo. The heavy velvet drapes and tapestries that lined the corridor swallowed the sound instantly. He was wearing the same black suit as before, but here, against the backdrop of his ancestors' portraits, who glared down at Hermione with painted sneers, he looked less like a prisoner and more like the last guardian of a crumbling ruin. Hermione followed him. She told herself she was here for the asset seizure inventory. Section 7, Paragraph 4. Confiscation of dark artifacts and restricted literature. It was a standard procedure. But as they walked deeper into the manor, her professional detachment began to fray. She knew this hallway. She knew that drawing room door they had just passed. The phantom pain in her forearm throbbed, a psychosomatic echo of the word carved into her skin. She glanced at Draco's back. He was walking stiffly, his gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to look at the rooms they passed. He was ghosting through his own life. "Here," he said, pushing open a set of double doors. Hermione stopped. Despite the circumstances, a small, involuntary gasp escaped her lips. The library was magnificent. It was a cathedral of knowledge, a cavernous space with a domed ceiling painted with moving constellations. Floor-to-ceiling shelves made of dark mahogany stretched up into the shadows, filled with thousands of books. It was beautiful, breathless, and oppressive. "Don't get too attached, Granger," Draco said, his voice dry. "Half of them are likely to bite you. The other half are being seized by your department." "Only the Class A cursed materials," Hermione corrected automatically, stepping into the room. She felt the hum of magic immediately, a low, vibrating thrum that seemed to come from the books themselves. The historical texts remained property of the estate. "Generous," he murmured, moving toward a large oak table in the center of the room. It was piled high with crates. "I've pulled the volumes your team requested. Poisons, blood magic, necrotic theory." He gestured to the pile. It looked like a mound of rotting leather and black iron. Hermione approached the table. She set her clipboard down and pulled on her dragon-hide gloves. This was the work. This was safe. Categorize, assess, confiscate. "Thank you," she said stiffly. "I need to verify the magical signature of each one before we tag them for transport." Draco didn't leave. Usually, during these inspections, the homeowner would retreat, resentful and angry. But Draco remained. He stood on the other side of the table, watching her. He didn't look angry. He looked anchored, as if this room was the only place in the manor where he felt real. "That one," he pointed as she reached for a thick black tome bound in something that looked suspiciously like skin. "Careful. It screams if you open it too quickly." Hermione paused, her hand hovering over the cover. She looked up at him. "You've read it?" "I lived in this house for 18 years, Granger. I've read everything." It was the only way to avoid conversations downstairs. The implication hung in the air. The library as a bunker. The books as shields against the Death Eaters dining in the hall. Hermione felt a sudden, sharp pang of understanding. She knew what it was like to hide in a book to escape the world. "Let's get it over with," she whispered. They worked in silence for an hour. The only sounds were the scratching of her quill, the rustle of pages, and the distant, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock. The sun began to set, casting long, blood-red beams of light through the high windows. The dust motes danced in the light, swirling around them. It was almost peaceful, a strange, fragile domesticity born of necessity. Draco wasn't hindering her. He was anticipating her. When she needed to reach a high shelf for a cross-reference, a ladder slid silently into place before she could draw her wand. When the light faded, candles flickered to life in the sconces without a word spoken. He was watching her, not with malice, but with a focused intensity. He watched her hands as she examined the artifacts. He watched the way she bit her lip when she deciphered a difficult rune. "You're shaking," he said suddenly. Hermione froze. She looked at her hands. They were steady. "I am not." "Not your hands," he said, nodding toward her arm. "Your breath. You're taking shallow breaths. You do that when you're analyzing a countercurse." Hermione stared at him. "How would you know that?" "I told you," he said, his grey eyes catching the candlelight. "I observe. In arithmancy, 4th year, whenever you were stuck on an equation, you'd hold your breath until you solved it. You're doing it now." Hermione felt the air leave her lungs in a rush. He remembered that? From 4th year, when they were bitter enemies? "It's a complex signature," she deflected, looking back down at the box of dark artifacts. I can't identify the core of this one. She reached for a small, ornate silver box. It was beautiful, etched with serpents, but it felt freezing cold to the touch, even through her gloves. "Don't," Draco said sharply, but she had already lifted the lid. A hiss filled the room. Not a sound, but a psychic pressure. A cloud of black smoke erupted from the box, twisting into shapes. Screams, flashes of green light, a cold, high laughter that made Hermione's blood turn to ice. It was a boggart box, a nasty, dark object designed to project the opener's worst memories. Hermione slammed the lid shut instantly. The smoke vanished. The laughter cut off. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "I told you." Draco's voice was strained. She looked up. He hadn't moved back. He was standing right there across the table, but his face had gone distinctive, chalky white. He wasn't looking at the box. He was looking at his left arm. His hand, his right hand, was gripping his left forearm so tightly that his fingertips were digging into the fabric of his suit. He was trembling, a fine, violent tremor that traveled up his shoulder. His eyes were wide, unfocused, staring at nothing. The noise from the box, the laughter, it hadn't just affected her. It was his aunt's laughter. "Draco," she said softly. He didn't hear her. He was somewhere else. He was back in the war. The mask of the stoic, resigned prisoner had shattered, revealing the terrified boy underneath. He was gasping for air, short, sharp inhalations that didn't seem to bring any oxygen. Hermione recognized it. Panic. Pure, physiological panic. She could have called the medical team. She could have left the room. She could have maintained her professional distance. Instead, she stripped off her dragon hide gloves. She walked around the table. He didn't react to her approach. He was locked in a spiral, his body rigid, trapped in the memory the box had unleashed. Hermione stopped a foot away from him. She didn't touch him. She knew better than to touch a wizard in the middle of a flashback. "Draco," she said again, firmly this time. "Look at the floor. Look at the wood." He didn't blink. Hermione raised her wand. She didn't cast a calming charm. That felt invasive, a chemical violation of his mind. Instead, she flicked her wand at the empty space on the table between them. Aguamenti. A crystal goblet materialized, filling with cool, clear water. The sound of the water pouring, a simple, natural, clean sound, cut through the heavy atmosphere of the library. "Drink," she commanded gently. Draco's eyes flickered. The sound anchored him. He looked at the water, then he looked at her. The terror in his eyes was raw, naked. He looked ashamed. "I can't," he rasped. His hands were still shaking too badly to hold a glass. If he tried, he would spill it, and the humiliation would break him. Hermione understood. She saw the pride warring with the panic. Without a word, she picked up the goblet. She held it out, not to his mouth, but just within his reach, steady and waiting. She lowered her gaze, looking at his chest instead of his eyes, giving him the privacy of not being watched in his weakest moment. "It's just a reaction," she said, her voice low and clinical, stripping the emotion away to make it manageable for him. "Adrenaline dump, cortisol spike. It's biology, Draco. It's not weakness." He let out a shuddering breath. Slowly, agonizingly, he released the death grip on his arm. He reached out. His fingers brushed hers, cold skin against warm. The contact sent a jolt through her, sharp and electric. He took the glass. He needed 2 hands to hold it steady. He drank, the water spilling slightly down his chin, but he drank. Hermione waited. She didn't wipe the spill. She didn't offer a handkerchief. She just stood there, her presence a solid wall between him and the shadows of the room. After a long minute, he lowered the glass. The colour was returning to his face, though he still looked translucent. He set the goblet down with a clatter. "I apologize," he said stiffly. He turned away from her, leaning his hands on the table, head bowed. That was unprofessional. "We are standing in a room full of cursed objects in the house where you were tortured," Hermione said, her voice fierce. "If you were perfectly fine, I would be worried." Draco let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He turned his head to look at her sideways. "You have a very strange definition of comfort, Granger. I prefer logic to platitudes." "Logic," he repeated. He turned fully to face her. The distance between them had vanished. They were standing in the darkening library, surrounded by monsters bound in leather, and he was looking at her as if he had never seen her before. "Why didn't you leave?" he asked quietly. "You could have walked out. Let me fall apart alone." "Because," Hermione said, feeling the weight of the truth on her tongue. "I know what that laughter sounds like too. I hear it when I sleep." Draco stared at her. His gaze dropped to her arm, hidden under her sleeve. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't say, "It wasn't me." He knew those words were useless. Instead, he did something else. He reached out, his hand hovering near her elbow. He didn't touch her, but the heat of his palm radiated through her robe. It was a question, a silent request for permission. Hermione didn't pull away. She held her breath. "It's biology," he whispered, echoing her words, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. "But it hurts." "Yes," she breathed. "It hurts." For a moment, the air around them seemed to bend. The tension wasn't hostile anymore. It was magnetic. It was the pull of 2 people standing on the edge of a cliff, realizing they were tied to the same rope. He was close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his grey eyes, close enough to see the pulse jumping in his throat. She wanted to step closer. The urge was terrifying. It wasn't logical. It was visceral. She wanted to bridge the gap, to prove that they had both survived. Then the grandfather clock struck the hour. Bong, bong, bong. The sound shattered the moment like glass. Draco flinched, pulling his hand back as if he had been burned. The mask slammed back down, though it fit poorly now. He straightened his spine, clearing his throat. We should finish the inventory," he said, his voice ragged. "The ministry closes at 6. Hermione blinked, disoriented, as if waking from a trance. She stepped back, her heart racing. Yes, of course. I just need to tag the box." She turned back to the table, her hands trembling now. She picked up her quill. "Granger," Draco said. She paused, not turning around. "Thank you," he said. It was barely a whisper, swallowed by the shadows of the library. "For the water." "It was just water, Malfoy," she replied, her voice sounding too loud, too defensive. "No," he said. "It wasn't." Hermione didn't answer. She focused on the parchment, the ink blurring slightly under her gaze. She tagged the boggart box for incineration. As they finished the work in silence, the atmosphere in the room had changed. The cold was still there, and the dark magic still hummed from the shelves. But the space between them was no longer filled with the debris of the war. It was filled with something fragile, something that felt dangerously like trust. And as Hermione walked out of the manor that evening, leaving him alone in the silence, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had left a piece of herself behind in that library. And worse, she had taken a piece of him with her. The Ministry of Magic atrium was a cacophony of bureaucracy, a stark, violent contrast to the hushed sanctity of the Malfoy library. Here, there was no smell of old parchment or cedar. The air reeked of ozone, cheap coffee, and the sweat of 1,000 anxious employees. The golden statues of the Fountain of Magical Brethren had been replaced by a brutalist monument to the fallen, a slab of black granite that seemed to suck the light out of the room. Hermione navigated the morning crush, clutching a cup of lukewarm tea. Her mind, usually a fortress of schedules and statutes, was dangerously distracted. She kept replaying the scene in the library, the tremble in his hand, the water glass, the way the grey of his eyes had shifted from stormy to open. She had seen a human being beneath the wreckage of the Death Eater. She had felt a connection that terrified her logic but soothed her soul. She was softening. She knew it. And for the first time in months, she didn't hate the feeling. "Investigator Granger!" The sharp, nasal voice sliced through her thoughts. Hermione stopped, nearly spilling her tea. A wizard in lime green robes was pushing through the crowd toward her. It was Albert Runcorn from the Office of Financial Surveillance, a man who treated galleons like religious artifacts. "Mr. Runcorn," Hermione said, composing herself, "I'm on my way to the briefing." "Forget the briefing," Runcorn snapped, shoving a scroll into her free hand. He looked triumphant, like a ferret who had finally cornered a rat. "We found it. The trace on the Malfoy accounts. You were right to keep the surveillance active." Hermione's stomach gave a sickening lurch. "Found what?" "Movement," Runcorn hissed, tapping the parchment with a bony finger. "Last night, at 3:06 a.m., a transfer of 5,000 galleons from a shadow vault we didn't know existed. It bypassed the Ministry freeze completely." Hermione stared at the numbers. The ink was still fresh. 3:02 a.m. She felt the blood drain from her face. At 3:02 a.m., she had been lying in bed, staring at her ceiling, worrying about Draco's panic attack. At 3:02 a.m., she'd been feeling guilty for his suffering. And at 3:02 a.m., Draco Malfoy, who had stood before her hours earlier, shaking and broken, claiming he had nothing left, had been moving gold. "Where did it go?" she whispered. Her voice felt hollow. "Untraceable. A dead drop in nocturne oases," Runcorn sneered. "Smuggling routes. He's liquidating Granger. He's buying an escape route." The world tilted. The noise of the atrium roared back in, deafening. "He played you." The thought was a physical blow. The vulnerability in the library, the panic attack, the water. Was it performance art? Had he used his own trauma as a weapon to distract her while he organized his flight? "Are you sure it was him?" she asked, desperate for a technicality. "The magical signature on the authorization key is unmistakable," Runcorn said, looking at her with pitying eyes. "It was Draco Malfoy. He's lying to you, Granger. He's been lying the whole time." Hermione gripped the scroll so hard the parchment crumpled. The warmth she had felt the night before turned to ice in her veins. She didn't feel professional anger. She felt the hot, stinging shame of a woman who had let her guard down for a predator. She had offered him water. He had taken her for a fool. "Thank you, Albert," she said, her voice deadly calm. "I will handle this." She turned on her heel and marched toward the lifts. She didn't go to her office. She went straight to the holding cells. The interrogation room was cold. Draco was already there, sitting in the same chair, staring at the wall. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes purple and bruised. When the door slammed open, he turned. He saw her face, and the faint, tentative smile he had started to form died instantly. He didn't need legitimacy to read the energy radiating off her. It was pure, unadulterated fury. "Hermione," he asked, the name slipping out before he could catch it. "Sit down," she barked. She didn't sit. She prowled around the table, a predator circling a trap. She threw the scroll onto the metal surface. It landed with a slap that echoed like a gunshot. "Explain." Draco looked at the scroll. He didn't reach for it. He barely glanced at the numbers before his jaw tightened. He knew exactly what it was. "I can't," he said. His voice was flat. The vulnerability from the library was gone, evaporated as if it never existed. "You can't." Hermione let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "You stood there yesterday. You looked me in the eye. You told me you had no influence. You told me you were stripped bare. All I have is the truth. Isn't that what you said? Granger, don't you dare!" She slammed her hands on the table, leaning into his space. This time, there was no intimacy in the proximity. There was only violence. 5,000 galleons, Draco. While you were shaking and gasping for air in that library, were you laughing inside? Were you calculating how long it would take to buy a port key to Brazil? Draco flinched. The accusation hit him visibly. "I am not trying to run." "Then what is it? A bribe? Buying back a dark artifact? Funding a new movement?" She was shouting now, her composure shattered. "I defended you. In my reports, I wrote that you were cooperating. I wrote that you were honest. I made myself look like an idiot for you." Draco looked up at her. His eyes were hard, the grey turning to steel. "I never asked you to defend me." "No, you just manipulated me into doing it." "It's not what you think," he said through gritted teeth. "Then tell me what it is," Hermione pleaded, her voice cracking. "Give me one reason not to walk out of this room and file a recommendation for immediate incarceration in Azkaban. Tell me who the money is for." Draco stared at her. His mouth opened, then closed. Hermione saw the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing his options. If he told her the truth, that the money was likely blackmail or paying for something he couldn't legally justify, he was doomed. But if he stayed silent, he was doomed. She waited. She wanted him to trust her. She wanted him to say, "I'm in trouble. Help me." Instead, Draco sat back in his chair. The mask slid down over his face. The old mask. The sneer of the pure-blood prince. The arrogance that he used to wear like armor at Hogwarts. It was flimsy now, cracked and dusty, but it was the only shield he had left. "It's my gold, Granger," he drawled, his voice dripping with a cold, fabricated disdain. "I can spend it on whatever I like. Maybe I just wanted a bottle of fire whiskey that doesn't taste like ministry piss." The insult was lazy. It was weak, but it was a door slamming in her face. Hermione recoiled as if he had slapped her. She saw it clearly then. He wasn't going to let her in. He would rather she hate him than know the truth. He would rather be the villain she expected than the victim he was. "I see," Hermione whispered. The fire in her chest died, leaving only cold ash. "So, the boy in the library, that was the lie." Draco didn't answer. He looked at his hands, his face impassive, but under the table his knuckles were white where he gripped his thigh. "Fine," Hermione said. She snatched the scroll off the table. "If you want to play the villain, Malfoy, I will treat you like one. From this moment on, all your assets are frozen. Not just the vaults, everything. The manor is on lockdown. If a single nut moves without my authorization, I will have you in a cell before you can blink. Do what you have to do," he said to the empty air. "I will," she promised. She walked to the door, her movements stiff. She paused with her hand on the handle, not looking back. "I actually thought you were different. That was my mistake. It won't happen again." The door clanged shut. Inside the room, the silence rushed back in. Draco waited until the sound of her footsteps faded completely. Only then did the mask crumble. He slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. He let out a ragged breath that sounded like a sob. The money wasn't for an escape. It wasn't for dark magic. It was for a healer in France, a specialist in curse damage who was the only one willing to treat his mother's fading health off the books, because no St. Mungo's doctor would touch a Malfoy without reporting it. He had saved his mother's life, and to do it, he had just destroyed the only lifeline he had left. He had seen the light go out in Hermione's eyes, the warmth replaced by the cold, bureaucratic stare of a judge. He had broken her trust to keep his secret. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty grey room. But the room, like the law, didn't care. 3 days passed. The atmosphere in the Ministry archives had shifted from tense to toxic. Hermione worked with a ruthless efficiency now. She stopped looking for nuance. She looked for facts. She tore through the Malfoy financial records with a vengeance, documenting every discrepancy, every loophole. She didn't visit the holding cells. She sent juniors to conduct the daily check-ins. She couldn't bear to see him. She couldn't bear the reminder of how easily she had been fooled. On the 4th evening, it was raining again. Hermione was packing her bag, her movements sharp and angry. Her office was dark, lit only by the street lamps outside. A memo airplane zoomed in through the open door and landed on her desk. It wasn't the usual purple Ministry interdepartmental parchment. It was plain, heavy white paper. She unfolded it. There was no signature, just a single line of elegant, familiar handwriting. Section 42, row C. The truth is in the ashes. Hermione stared at the note. Her heart gave a traitorous leap. She recognized the handwriting. It was Draco's. She crumpled the note in her fist. It was another game, another manipulation. He was trying to lure her back in. She threw the paper into the bin. She put on her cloak. She grabbed her wand. She walked to the door. Then she stopped. The truth is in the ashes. She looked back at the bin. "Damn you," she hissed. She retrieved the note. Section 42, row C. That was in the evidence room, the sector for destroyed or partially destroyed documents recovered from Death Eater safe houses. Why would he send her there? He had just stonewalled her. He had mocked her, unless he couldn't say it. Unless saying it out loud in an interrogation room where the dicta quills were recording would kill him. Hermione stood in the doorway, caught between her pride and her insatiable need to know. The logical part of her brain screamed that it was a trap. The emotional part, the part that remembered the trembling boy in the library, whispered that it was a plea. She shouldn't go. She really shouldn't go. She turned off the light in her office. "I'm going to regret this," she muttered to the darkness. She headed for the lifts, pressing the button for the evidence level. She told herself she was just doing her job. She was investigating a lead. That was all. But as the lift descended, plunging her deeper into the earth, she knew she was lying. She wasn't chasing evidence. She was chasing him. She was chasing the ghost of the connection they had shared, terrified that she had hallucinated it, and desperate to prove that she hadn't. The lift doors opened with a ding that sounded like a warning bell. Hermione stepped out into the shadows of the evidence room, her wand raised, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The game had changed again, and she was terrified of what she was about to find. The evidence room was a graveyard of bad memories. Located in the deepest sub-basement of the Ministry, it was a cavernous hall filled with towering rows of metal shelving, each laden with the debris of the war. There were no windows here, no sound of the rain, only the low electrical hum of the preservation stasis charms and the smell of cold ash. Hermione walked down row C, her wand tip glowing with a harsh white light. The shadows stretched long and distorted against the shelves, looking like snatchers reaching out to grab her. Section 42. Recovered documents from Malfoy Manor, West Wing, destroyed. She stopped. The shelf in front of her was piled with charred boxes. These were items salvaged from the fire Crabbe had set in the Room of Requirement, or perhaps from the raids that followed the battle. They were ashes, literally and metaphorically. Her heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She didn't want to open them. She wanted to turn back, go home, and hate Draco Malfoy in peace. Hate was clean. Hate was simple. But she reached out. Her hand trembled as she pulled down a box marked with a fading tracking spell. Inside, the smell of smoke was overpowering. It choked her, tasting of dark magic and desperation. There were no gold bars here, no portkeys, just a stack of partially burned parchment bound together with a strip of black ribbon. Hermione untied the ribbon. The parchment was brittle, flaking away under her touch. She held the light closer, squinting at the cramped, frantic handwriting. It wasn't Draco's. It was jagged, unfamiliar script. Condition is deteriorating faster than anticipated. The curse has entered the marrow. Standard counterspells are ineffective due to the familial bond. Hermione frowned, flipping to the next page. Requires rare ingredients from the black market. The Ministry has restricted access. If you want her to survive the winter, Mr. Malfoy, the cost is tripled. 5,000 galleons, unmarked. Delivered to the drop point in Nocturne by the 3rd. The letter was signed by a healer who had been struck off the register years ago for experimental blood magic. Hermione felt the floor drop out from under her. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. She looked at the date on the letter. It was 2 days ago. The escape fund. The secret transfer. It wasn't for him. She leaned back against the metal shelving, the charred papers clutching in her hand like a lifeline. Narcissa Malfoy was dying. Draco wasn't liquidating assets to flee justice. He was emptying his vaults to buy his mother a few more months of life. And he was doing it through illegal channels, because no reputable healer would touch a Malfoy, and the Ministry had frozen their legitimate access to funds. He had committed a crime. Technically, Runcorn was right. Draco had bypassed Ministry sanctions, funded a black market practitioner, and likely traded restricted artifacts to get the liquid cash. It was a felony. It was grounds for immediate imprisonment. but the intent. Hermione closed her eyes. The image of Draco in the interrogation room flashed behind her eyelids. The exhaustion, the desperate silence, the way he had taken her insults without defending himself. He had let her believe he was a villain because the truth would implicate his mother in illegal healing practices. He had chosen to let Hermione despise him rather than risk Narcissa's treatment being discovered, and stopped. "You idiot," she whispered into the silence. Her voice broke. "You absolute self-sacrificing idiot." She didn't know how long she stood there, surrounded by the ashes of his past, holding the proof of his tragic present. But when she finally moved, she didn't go to Runcorn. She didn't go to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. She swept the papers into her bag, turned on her heel, and ran. The storm had worsened by the time she reached her office. Thunder rattled the window panes, and lightning flashed intermittently, illuminating the room in stark, blue-white bursts. Hermione didn't turn on the lamps. She didn't need the softness of candlelight tonight. She needed the dark. She sent a Patronus, not a memo. A silver otter that slipped through the walls, carrying a message that was not a request, but a summons. 10 minutes later, the door opened. Draco stood there. He was drenched. He must have been walking in the holding yard, or perhaps he had just been dragged through the rain by the auras. His hair was plastered to his skull, water dripping from the ends of his nose and chin. He looked like a drowned thing, a wreckage. He didn't step inside. He hovered in the doorway, shivering slightly. He couldn't see her clearly in the gloom. She was just a silhouette behind her desk, backlit by the lightning outside the window. "You found it," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was hoarse, devoid of hope. "Come in," Hermione said. Her voice was low, trembling with a mixture of rage and grief. Draco stepped in and closed the door. The sound of the latch clicking shut was final. He didn't take the chair. He stood in the middle of the room, water pooling around his shoes on the expensive rug. He waited for the shouting. He waited for the arrest warrant. Hermione stood up. She walked around her desk, clutching the charred letters in her hand. She stopped a few feet away from him. The smell of rain and ozone coming off him was intense, mixing with the scent of burnt paper on her own skin. "Narcissa," she said. Draco flinched. The name hit him harder than a curse. He looked away, staring at the floor, his jaw working as he tried to keep his composure. She doesn't have much time," he whispered. "The stress of the trial, it accelerated the family curse. I couldn't watch her die, Granger. I couldn't just sit there and let the ministry debate her fate while her blood turned to poison." "So you broke the law," Hermione said. It wasn't an accusation anymore. It was a statement of fact. "The law doesn't care about her," Draco said, his voice rising, cracking with sudden emotion. He looked up, his eyes wild and wet. "The law wants us erased. I had to do it. I sold the Black family ring. I sold everything I could hide from you. I paid the healer. She got the potion this morning." He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if remembering he had lost the right to approach. "I did it," he confessed, opening his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I moved the gold. I hired a dark practitioner. I am guilty, Hermione. I am guilty of everything you suspected, just not the motive." He reached into his wet jacket pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in cloth. He held it out to her. "Here," he choked out. Hermione hesitated. "What is it?" "The receipt," he said. "Proof of the transaction. It contains the magical signature of the illegal transfer. It's the final nail in the coffin. If you give this to the Wizengamot, along with those letters, I'll get 5 years in Azkaban. Minimum." Hermione stared at the cloth in his hand. Then she looked at his face. He was offering her his life. He was handing her the weapon to destroy him, completely and utterly. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the thunder. "Why give this to me? You could have destroyed it. You could have kept lying. Why lead me to the ashes?" Draco looked at her, and the raw vulnerability in his face was blinding. The lightning flashed again, illuminating the tears mixing with the rain on his cheeks. "Because I couldn't stand it," he whispered. "I could stand the prison. I could stand the Dementors. But I couldn't stand you looking at me like that." Hermione's breath hitched. "Like what?" "Like I was a coward," he said, his voice breaking. "Like I was just another Death Eater trying to save his own skin. I needed you to know." He took a shaky breath. "I needed you to know that I stayed. I stayed for her, and I stayed for the trial." He took her hand, cold, wet, trembling, and pressed the evidence into her palm. He closed her fingers over it. "Do your job, Granger," he rasped. "Send me away. But please, just know the truth." He let go of her hand and stepped back, his eyes closing, waiting for the end. Hermione stood there, the weight of the evidence heavy in her hand. It was cold, hard proof. It was his doom, and it was the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for her. He had chosen his mother's life over his freedom, and he had chosen Hermione's respect over his safety. He had stripped himself of every defense just to prove to her that he was a man of honor, even if that honor was twisted by circumstance. The conflict that had been raging inside her, the war between the judge and the woman, came to a screeching, violent halt. The judge died in that moment. Hermione turned to her desk. "Granger!" Draco opened his eyes, confused by her silence. Hermione picked up her wand. She looked at the charred letters. She looked at the heavy object in the cloth. "Incendio," she whispered. Draco gasped. A jet of orange flame erupted from her wand. It didn't hit the fireplace. It hit the evidence in her hand. The parchment curled and blackened, turning to ash instantly. The cloth flared up, the magical receipt inside glowing red-hot before crumbling into nothingness, the magic binding it shattering under the force of her spell. "What are you doing?" Draco shouted, lurching forward. He looked horrified. "That was your case. That was your proof." Hermione dropped the smoking remnants into the metal waste bin. She turned to face him. The fire was reflected in her eyes, burning bright and fierce. "I don't see any proof," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I see a pile of ash." Draco stopped, frozen in the middle of the room. He stared at the bin, then at her. He looked like he had been struck by a stunning spell. "Hermione, you can't. That's obstruction of justice. You could lose your job. You could go to jail." "I am the lead investigator," she said, stepping toward him. She closed the distance, invading his space, ignoring the water dripping from his clothes. "And I decide what is relevant to this case. A son paying for his mother's medical care is not a crime I am willing to prosecute." "But I lied to you." "You protected her," Hermione yelled back, matching his intensity. "You did what I would have done. Do you think I wouldn't have broken every law in the ministry to save my parents? Do you think I don't know what that feels like? She was breathing hard, her chest heaving. She was inches from him now. She could feel the heat radiating from his cold body, the sheer shock rolling off him in waves. "You are not a coward, Draco," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. She reached out, her hand hovering, then landing firmly on his wet chest, right over his heart. She could feel it hammering like a trapped bird. "You are the bravest person I have met in a long time." Draco stared down at her. His defenses were gone. His logic was gone. There was only the storm, the dark room, and the woman who had just burned her own integrity to keep him warm. "Why?" he choked out. "Why would you do that for me?" Hermione looked up into his grey eyes, seeing the depths of his soul, the cracks and the gold that filled them. "Because," she whispered, her thumb brushing the lapel of his ruined suit, "I finally see the truth." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the roar of the blood in their ears. The line had been crossed. The judge and the prisoner were gone. There was only a man and a woman, standing in the wreckage of their expectations, bound together by a secret that could destroy them both. Draco let out a sound, a broken, desperate exhale. He looked at her mouth. Then he looked at her eyes, seeking one last confirmation. "Granger," he warned, his voice a low rumble. "If you don't step back, I won't be able to stop." Hermione didn't step back. She stepped closer. Her hand slid up his chest, her fingers curling into the wet fabric of his collar. "Then don't," she breathed. The tension snapped. It wasn't a slow dissolve. It was a collision. Draco moved. His restraint shattered. He didn't reach for her gently. He grabbed her, his hands tangled in her hair, his other arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her against him with a force that knocked the breath out of her. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling sharply as if he had been drowning and she was air. He was shaking, violent, full-body tremors that had nothing to do with the cold. Hermione wrapped her arms around his shoulders, holding him, anchoring him. She felt the damp cold of his clothes seeping into hers, but where they touched, it was burning hot. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. He just held her, crushing her to him, his forehead pressed against her pulse point. It was an embrace of absolute desperation. It was a surrender. "I thought I lost you," he muffled against her skin. "I thought I lost you before I even had you." "I'm here," Hermione whispered into his wet hair. "I'm right here." The storm raged outside, battering the ministry walls. But inside the office, in the dark and the quiet, the real storm had finally broken. And for the first time since the war began, neither of them was fighting alone. The office was quiet, save for the sound of their breathing and the relentless drumming of the rain against the window. The air was thick, charged with the lingering magic of the incendio spell and the scent of burnt parchment, a sharp, acrid smell that mixed with the clean, cold ozone radiating from Draco's drenched clothes. Hermione didn't move. She couldn't. Her hands were still clutching the lapels of his jacket, her knuckles white, anchoring herself to him, as if letting go would mean falling off the edge of the world. She could feel the cold dampness of the wool soaking into her own palms. But beneath it, the heat of his body was overwhelming. It burned through the layers, a feverish, desperate warmth. Draco's face was buried in the crook of her neck. He was breathing in jagged, uneven gasps, the the kind that come after a near-death experience. His arms were locked around her waist, bands of steel that trembled with a fine, suppressed vibration. "You're ruining yourself," he murmured against her skin. His voice was a vibration against her pulse, low and rough. "Granger, you have no idea what you've just done." "I know exactly what I've done," Hermione whispered. Her voice sounded foreign to her ears, deeper, stripped of its usual brisk authority. She pulled back slightly, just enough to look at him. He lifted his head. His hair was a mess of wet blonde strands plastered to his forehead. Water dripped from his chin, tracing a line down his throat. But it was his eyes that held her. They were wide, dark-pupilled, stripped of all occlusion. The grey was turbulent, swirling with a mixture of awe, terror, and a hunger so raw it made her knees weak. He looked at her as if she were a puzzle he had spent his whole life trying to solve, only to find the answer was something he wasn't allowed to touch. "You burned the evidence," he said, as if trying to make sense of the reality. "You just erased it." "It wasn't evidence," she corrected softly, her hands sliding up to cup his jaw. His skin was cold, rough with stubble. "It was a receipt for a son saving his mother. I don't prosecute love, Draco. I prosecute crimes." He closed his eyes at her touch, leaning into her palms with a heavy sigh. "You are illogical," he whispered, a faint, incredulous smile touching his lips. "Brilliant, terrifying, and completely illogical." "I'm tired of logic," she admitted. The truth of it washed over her. She was exhausted by rules, by statutes, by the endless black-and-white categorization of a grey world. "I'm just tired." Draco opened his eyes. The playfulness vanished, replaced by an intensity that stole the air from the room. He raised a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and brushed a stray wet curl from her cheek. His touch was revered, hesitant, as if he expected her to shatter. "Then stop thinking," he commanded softly. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone down to the corner of her mouth. He watched the movement of his own hand, mesmerized. "Stop thinking, Hermione, just for a minute." The use of her first name, spoken with such deliberate, heavy intent, broke the last thread of her restraint. Hermione didn't think. She acted. She rose on her toes, closing the agonizing inch between them, and pressed her lips to his. It wasn't a movie kiss. It wasn't graceful. It was a collision of two worlds that had been orbiting each other for years, finally crashing together. It tasted of rain, of salt, of the metallic tang of magic. Draco froze for a split second, his body rigid with shock. Then, with a low groan that vibrated in his chest, he broke. His hands tangled in her hair, gripping tight, tilting her head back to deepen the angle. He didn't kiss her gently. He kissed her like a starving man finally given bread. It was desperate, messy, and consuming. He devoured her sigh, his mouth moving over hers with a frantic urgency, seeking, taking, giving everything he had held back for a decade. Hermione melted against him. The cold of his wet clothes ceased to matter. The dampness only made the heat between them more acute. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him down, needing to be closer than physics allowed. She felt the hard line of his body against hers, the tension in his muscles, the rapid, hammering beat of his heart against her chest. He tasted of mint and grief. She tasted of tea and redemption. They stumbled back, his legs hitting the edge of her desk. He didn't break the kiss. He lifted her effortlessly, setting her onto the mahogany surface, stepping between her knees to get closer. The files and quills on the desk were swept aside, crashing to the floor, forgotten. Hermione gasped as the contact broke for a second, only for him to attack her jawline, his lips trailing hot, wet paths down her throat. "I have wanted to do this," he muttered against her skin, his voice a growl of frustration and desire. "Gods, I have wanted to do this since 4th year, since the Yule Ball, since I saw you in that blue dress and realized I was on the wrong side of everything." Hermione's heart stopped, then restarted at double speed. She gripped his shoulders, pulling him back up to face her. "You... what?" she breathed. Draco looked at her, his lips swollen, his eyes blown wide. He looked wrecked. "Why do you think I hated you so much?" He laughed bitterly, a sharp, self-deprecating sound. "It wasn't because of your blood, Hermione. It was because you were everything I wasn't. You were brave, you were brilliant, and you were... you." He leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. "I hated you because I couldn't have you, and because I knew I didn't deserve you." "You have me," she whispered, fierce and low. "You have me right now." "Do I?" He pulled back, searching her face. The fear was creeping back in, edging out the passion. "Look at us, Granger. I'm a waiting convict. You're the High Inquisitor. Tomorrow morning you have to walk into that courtroom and decide my fate. This..." He gestured between them, his hand shaking. "This is madness. This is a conflict of interest that could get you disbarred." "I don't care," she said, and she meant it. "Let me worry about the court. Tonight isn't about the law." She reached for his tie, the black silk tie of a defendant, and loosened it. Her fingers brushed the hollow of his throat. "Draco," she said, saying his name like a spell. "I am not the judge right now. I am just a woman, and you are just a man. Can we just be that? For one night?" Draco stared at her. He looked at her hands on his tie, then back up to her eyes. He seemed to be fighting a war inside his head, a battle between his conscience telling him to protect her by leaving, and his heart screaming at him to stay. The heart won. "One night," he whispered, the surrender absolute. He captured her lips again, but this time the desperation was tempered by a slow, agonizing tenderness. It was a kiss of worship. His hands roamed over her back, memorizing the shape of her spine, the curve of her waist through her robes. He touched her as if he were blind, and she was the only braille he knew how to read. The storm outside raged on, thunder shaking the walls of the ministry, but in the office, the world had shrunk to the size of the desk. They didn't go further than that. There was no shedding of clothes, no frantic race to the finish. It wasn't about sex. It was about intimacy. It was about the way he held her face in his hands, looking at her as if she were the sun, and he had lived in a cave his whole life. It was about the way she ran her fingers through his wet hair, soothing the tension that had lived in his shoulders for years. They stayed there for hours. Eventually, they slid down to the floor, sitting with their backs against the desk, shoulder to shoulder in the semi-darkness. Hermione relit the bluebell flames, casting the room in a soft, ghostly glow. Draco had removed his wet jacket. He sat in his shirt sleeves, the white fabric translucent against his skin, the dark mark hidden but present. He held her hand, his thumb tracing the scars on her knuckles, scars from the war, scars from her work. "What happens tomorrow?" he asked into the silence. His voice was quiet, stripped of all bravado. Hermione squeezed his hand. She didn't look at him. She looked at the dancing blue flames. I submit my final report. I present the evidence of your cooperation. I present the amended facts. And the verdict? I don't know, she admitted. The Wizengamot is divided. Half of them want to see the Malfoy line ended. The other half just want the gold. And you? Draco turned his head to look at her. What do you want? Hermione turned to meet his gaze. In the blue light, he looked ethereal, beautiful, and tragic. I want you to be free, she said simply. Draco's expression crumpled. He looked away, swallowing hard. I don't think freedom is in the cards for me, Hermione. Even if I escape Azkaban, I'm still me. I'm still the boy who let the Death Eaters into the school. I'm still the man who carries this. He flexed his left arm. We all carry things, she said firmly. She reached over and touched his left forearm, right over the sleeve. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. You are not your mark, Draco. You are the man who saved his mother. You are the man who fixed the vanishing cabinet not to kill, but to solve an equation. You are the man who sat in this office and told me the truth when lying would have been easier. She leaned her head on his shoulder. You are redeemable. He rested his cheek on the top of her head. He didn't speak for a long time. The silence stretched, filled with the ticking of the clock on the wall. Each tick was a second stolen, a second closer to the dawn. If I go to Azkaban, he said eventually, his voice barely a whisper, don't visit me. Hermione sat up, startled. What? Don't visit me, he repeated, his eyes hard and determined. I won't have you seeing me in there. I won't have you wasting your life waiting for a convict. You have a future, Hermione. You're going to be minister one day. You're going to change the world. Draco! Promise me, he interrupted, gripping her hand tightly. If the verdict goes the wrong way, you walk away. You forget this happened. You forget me. I can't do that, she said, tears pricking her eyes. You can't ask me to do that. I have to, he said, because it's the only way I can walk into that courtroom tomorrow, knowing that whatever happens to me, you will be okay, that you will remain untainted. Hermione looked at him, her heart breaking. He was trying to be noble. He was trying to protect her from his own darkness, even now. She raised his hand to her lips and kissed his knuckles one by one. I promise I will be okay, she lied. But I will never forget you, and I am not walking away until the gavel falls. Draco let out a shaky breath. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead. It was a benediction, a goodbye. That will have to be enough, he whispered. The first grey light of dawn began to creep through the window, turning the rain into sheets of silver. The bluebell flames flickered and died. The magic of the night was fading, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the morning. Draco stood up. He picked up his wet jacket and put it on. He smoothed his hair, buttoned his collar, and adjusted his tie. Slowly, layer by layer, he rebuilt the armor. The vulnerability vanished. The lover disappeared. The defendant returned. He looked at Hermione one last time. She was still sitting on the floor, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes and swollen lips. She looked beautiful. She looked like a tragedy waiting to happen. Thank you, Investigator Granger, he said formally, his voice devoid of emotion, for hearing me. You're welcome, Mr. Malfoy, she replied, her voice trembling. He turned and walked to the door. He didn't look back. The door clicked shut. Hermione remained on the floor. She brought her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold on to the warmth he had left behind. But it was already fading. The trial was in 2 hours. She had to stand up. She had to wash her face, fix her hair, and put on her robes. She had to walk into the High Court and deliver a verdict that would either save the man she loved or condemn him to a living death. And she had to do it without letting a single person know that her heart was no longer impartial. It was his. And it was currently walking down the corridor, heading towards a cage. The dawn did not break. It bled into the sky. It was a bruise of purple and grey, pressing against the enchanted windows of the ministry, turning the raindrops into streaks of mercury. Hermione stood in the washroom on level 2, gripping the porcelain edge of the sink until her knuckles turned the colour of bone. The mirror above the basin was cracked in the corner, fracturing her reflection. She looked at herself, really looked. Her eyes were rimmed with red, the skin beneath them bruised with exhaustion. Her hair, usually tamed into a severe bun for court days, was wild, escaping the pins she had hastily jammed back in. But it was her mouth that betrayed her. Her lips were swollen, bitten, a shade darker than usual. They tingled with a phantom heat, a physical memory of the desperate, starving kisses shared in the dark. She turned on the tap. The water ran freezing cold. She splashed it onto her face, gasping as the shock hit her skin. She scrubbed hard, trying to wash away the scent of him, the cedar, the ozone, the rain. She had to scrub it off, because if anyone on the Wizengamot smelled Draco Malfoy on the High Inquisitor, the trial would be over before it began. "You are the law," she whispered to her reflection. The words sounded hollow, like a spell cast with a broken wand. She dried her face with a rough paper towel. She adjusted her robes, pulling the heavy black fabric tight around her throat. She pinned her badge, High Inquisitor, onto her chest. It felt heavier today. It felt like a target. She walked out of the washroom and into the corridor. The ministry was waking up. The early morning shift was arriving. Bleary-eyed clerks carrying stacks of memos, maintenance workers sweeping up the debris of yesterday's bureaucracy. They nodded to her as she passed. "Good morning, Miss Granger." "Good luck today, ma'am." Hermione nodded back, her neck stiff. They saw a hero. They saw the golden girl who would deliver justice. They didn't see the woman who had committed a felony 4 hours ago by burning evidence in a waste bin. They didn't see the woman who had let the defendant touch her soul before the trial had even concluded. She felt transparent. She felt as though the secret was written in neon letters across her forehead. "I love him. I compromised everything for him." She reached the lifts. The golden grills rattled open. "Level 10, she commanded. "Courtrooms." The lift descended. The air grew colder, thinner. The chatter of the upper levels faded, replaced by the low, ominous hum of the ancient magic that bound the Wizengamot. When the doors opened, Albert Runcorn was waiting. He was leaning against the stone wall, picking his teeth with a quill. His lime-green robes were bright and offensive in the gloom. When he saw her, he straightened, his beady eyes narrowing. "Granger," he said, stepping into her path. "You look like you slept in a crypt." "I was working late, Albert," Hermione said, her voice steady. She was a good liar when she had to be. The war had taught her that. "And?" Runcorn leaned in, smelling of peppermint and suspicion. "The lead? The 5,000 galleons? Did you track the transfer?" Hermione's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it, the point of no return. She looked him in the eye. She summoned the memory of Draco's hand on her cheek, the way he had looked at her when he said, "You are the bravest person I have met." She used that memory as a shield. "It was a dead end," she lied smoothly. "A clerical error in the goblin's ledger. The gold was never moved. It was a ghost transaction." Runcorn stared at her. He searched her face for a twitch, a blink, a sign of deceit. Hermione held his gaze, turning her exhaustion into a mask of boredom. "A clerical error," Runcorn repeated, skeptical. 5,000 galleons just vanishes and reappears? "Gringotts is old, Albert. Magic degrades. I've filed the report. It's closed." She stepped around him, her movement sharp and dismissive. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a man to sentence." She didn't wait for his response. She walked away, her heels clicking loudly on the stone floor. Her back was straight, but inside she was shaking. She had done it. She had officially obstructed justice. There was no going back now. Courtroom 10 was a cavern. It was a vast, circular amphitheatre cut from black stone, lit by hundreds of floating torches that cast long, flickering shadows. The high benches of the Wizengamot loomed above, filled with 50 wizards and witches in plum-coloured robes. They looked like a parliament of crows waiting for a carcass. The air was freezing. The Dementors were gone, banished after the war, but the room remembered them. The cold lingered in the stones, a permanent echo of despair. Hermione took her seat at the prosecutor's table. It was a lonely island in the centre of the room. To her right sat the defence attorney, a court-appointed wizard who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. He had barely spoken to Draco. He knew the odds. The gallery was packed. Reporters, ministry officials, curious onlookers. Hermione saw Harry in the front row, his face grim. He gave her a small, encouraging nod. He thought she was here to finish the war. He didn't know she was here to save the enemy. "Bring in the accused," the chief warlock, Tiberius Ogden, boomed from the high bench. The heavy iron doors at the base of the pit ground open. The sound was a screech of metal on stone that set Hermione's teeth on edge. Draco walked in. He was flanked by 2 auras, but he walked as if he were alone. He was wearing the same suit he had worn the night before, but it was dry now, pressed by magic. His hands were chained in front of him. The silver shackles glinted in the torchlight. He looked impeccable. The exhaustion, the vulnerability, the tears, they were all gone. He had rebuilt the Malfoy armor piece by piece. His chin was high, his face a mask of bored indifference. He looked at the Wizengamot not with fear, but with a cool, aristocratic disdain. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Harry. He looked at her. For a second, just a heartbeat, the mask slipped. His grey eyes met hers across the courtroom. In them, she saw the morning mist. She saw the memory of the bluebell flames. She saw the silent plea he had made in her office. "Don't save me. Save yourself." Then he looked away. He stepped into the iron cage in the center of the floor. The chair chains rattled as they wrapped around his arms and legs, binding him tight. He didn't flinch. He sat like a king on a throne of iron. "Draco Lucius Malfoy," Ogden's voice echoed. "You are brought before this council to answer for crimes committed during the Second Wizarding War. The charges are numerous. The evidence has been reviewed." Ogden turned his gaze to Hermione. Investigator Granger, you have led the inquiry into the Malfoy estate. You have conducted the interviews. You have analyzed the artifacts. The room went silent. 1,000 eyes turned to Hermione. The weight of their expectation was crushing. They wanted blood. They wanted her to point her finger and condemn the Death Eater. Hermione stood up. Her legs felt like lead. Her hands, resting on the parchment in front of her, were trembling so violently she had to press them flat against the wood to stop it. This was the moment. She looked at her report. The words swam before her eyes. Paragraph 4, active participation. Paragraph 7, use of dark objects. She could read it as written. She could send him to Azkaban for life. It would be easy. It would be safe. Runcorn would be happy. The public would cheer. She looked at Draco. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw locked. He was waiting for the blow. He was ready to take it. Hermione took a breath. The air tasted of dust and judgment. I don't prosecute love, Draco. I prosecute crimes. Chief Warlock, members of the Wizengamot, Hermione began. Her voice was quiet at first, but it gained strength as it hit the acoustics of the room. It rang clear and bell-like. For the past 6 months, I have dissected the life of the accused. I have looked into every vault, read every letter, and examined every spell cast. She paused. She picked up the file. Her fingers brushed the spot where the incinerated evidence should have been. The prosecution is expected to present a monster today, she said. A murmur ran through the crowd. Draco's head tilted slightly, a fraction of an inch. We are expected to present a man who acted with malice, with intent to destroy, Hermione continued, her eyes sweeping over the faces of the judges. And it would be easy to do so. The mark on his arm is a fact. The doors he opened are a fact. She looked at Harry. Harry was frowning, confused by her tone. She looked at Draco. He was watching her now, his eyes wide with warning. "Stop," his eyes said. "Don't do this." Hermione ignored him. She ignored the warning. She ignored the law. "However," she said, her voice dropping to a register that commanded absolute silence, "justice is not about the easy path. Justice is about the whole truth. And the truth I have found is not what this court expects." She opened the file. She didn't look at the notes she had prepared. She looked at the empty space between the lines. "I found a boy," she said, "who was given a task designed to kill him. I found a student who used unparalleled arithmancy, not to cause harm, but to navigate an impossible situation. I found a son." Her voice wavered. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "I found a son who, even when stripped of his wand and his status, used his last resources not to flee, but to protect his family." Runcorn stood up in the gallery. "Objection!" he shouted, his face purple. "The investigator is speculating. Where is the proof of these resources?" "Sit down!" Ogden banged his gavel. "Let her speak." Hermione didn't flinch. She turned to face Runcorn, then turned back to the court. "The proof," she said softly, "is in what is not in this file. There are no hidden accounts. There are no dark artifacts withheld. Mr. Malfoy has surrendered everything. He has cooperated with an honesty that I have rarely seen in this building." She looked at Draco. He was pale, his composure cracking. He looked terrified, not for himself, but for her. She was gambling her reputation on his soul. "We cannot judge a man solely by the worst day of his life," Hermione said, her voice ringing with a passion that stunned the room. "We must judge him by what he does when he has nothing left to lose, and what Draco Malfoy did. was choose humanity over pride. She closed the file. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. The prosecution, she stated, does not seek a life sentence. The room erupted. Shouts, gasps, the banging of the gavel. It was chaos. Hermione stood still in the center of the storm. She felt light. The weight was gone. She had told the truth, not the legal truth, but the real one. She looked at Draco through the noise. He was staring at her with an expression she would carry to her grave. It was a look of absolute devastation and absolute love. He was shaking his head slowly, tears standing in his eyes. "You fool," he mouthed. "You beautiful fool." Ogden banged the gavel until the room quieted. He looked down at Hermione, his expression unreadable. "If the prosecution does not seek a life sentence, Miss Granger," Ogden rumbled, "then what does it recommend?" Hermione took a deep breath. This was the gamble. This was the verdict that would either free him or destroy her career. "I recommend," she said clearly, "time served, probation, and—" She paused. She looked at Draco, locking eyes with him. "And a full stripping of the Malfoy title and estate. He walks away with nothing but his freedom." Silence. Absolute, stunned silence. To the purebloods on the court, this was a fate worse than death. To lose the name? To lose the manor? To be a nobody? But Hermione saw Draco's shoulders drop. She saw him close his eyes and exhale. She knew. She knew that to him the name was a curse. The manor was a prison. She wasn't punishing him. She was liberating him. "That is my recommendation," Hermione finished. She sat down. Her hands were still shaking. Under the table, she clenched her fists. She had thrown the dice. Now she had to wait for them to land. Ogden turned to the Wizengamot. "The council will deliberate." The purple robes leaned together. The whispering began. It sounded like the rustling of dry leaves. It went on for minutes, hours, eternities. Hermione didn't look at them. She watched Draco. He sat in the cage, his head bowed, isolated in the spotlight. He looked small. Finally, the whispering stopped. The judges straightened. Ogden stood up. He held a scroll of parchment. "Draco Malfoy," he announced. Draco looked up. His face was a blank slate. "Stand." The chains rattled as Draco stood. He stood tall despite the shackles. "The court has heard the testimony of the High Inquisitor," Ogden said. Her words carry great weight in this hall. "We find her arguments compelling." Hermione let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "However," Ogden continued, his voice hardening, "the crimes cannot be ignored entirely." Hermione's heart stopped. "The council accepts the recommendation of the prosecution in part," Ogden ruled. "The estate is seized, the title is suspended, but for the crimes of the 6th year." He paused. "The accused is sentenced to 3 years of house arrest, without magic, to be served in a residence approved by the ministry." It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't Azkaban. And, Ogden added, a strange glint in his eye, given the High Inquisitor's familiarity with the case, the ministry appoints Hermione Granger as the probation officer responsible for the prisoner's oversight. Hermione's jaw dropped. Draco's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto hers. "Case closed." Ogden banged the gavel. The chains fell away from Draco's wrists. The cage lowered. He was free, technically, but he was bound to her. The crowd began to disperse, loud and argumentative. Hermione sat frozen. She had saved him. She had saved him from the Dementors. But as Draco turned to look at her, the reality of the sentence crashed down. He was her prisoner now. And looking at the fire in his eyes, a mix of relief and a dangerous, simmering hunger, she realized that the slow burn hadn't ended. It had just been given a new fuel source. The verdict was silence. But the sentence was them. The iron gates of the ministry slammed shut behind them, a sound like a guillotine dropping, severing the past from the present. The reporters had been held back by a barrier of auras, their shoutings muffled and distant, like the noise of a storm passing in another county. Hermione and Draco stood alone on the wet cobblestones of a side street in London, the grey sky pressing down on them. Draco stood still. He was not wearing a cloak. The rain soaked into his black suit, the same suit he had worn to his trial, now stripped of the family crest pins that had once held the collar stiff. His wrists were bare, the red marks from the shackles fading, but still visible against his pale skin. He had no wand. That was the most jarring change. His hands hung at his sides, fingers twitching occasionally, reaching for a pocket that was empty. The Wizengamot had snapped nothing, but they had taken everything. "Where are we going?" he asked. His voice was rough, unpolished. It lacked the sneer, the drawl, the cadence of the aristocracy. It was just a man's voice. Hermione gripped her own wand tightly inside her sleeve. She felt a phantom weight on her shoulders, the weight of the probation officer badge she had just been handed. "Blackwood Cottage," she said. "It's a ministry safe house in the Cotswolds, secluded, warded. It was the only property not on the seizure list." Draco let out a breath that misted in the cold air. He nodded once. He didn't argue. He didn't ask about the manor. He knew the manor was gone, its halls likely already being swarmed by curse breakers and debt collectors. "Take my arm," she said. He looked at her arm. Then he looked at her face. The rain plastered her hair to her cheeks, making her look younger, softer, yet her eyes were steel. She was his savior, and she was his jailer. He reached out. His hand closed around her forearm. His grip was firm, desperate. He wasn't holding her for balance. He was holding her to make sure she was real. "Ready?" she whispered. "Get me out of here, Granger." With a sharp crack, the alley dissolved. They reappeared in a whirl of wet grass and wind. Blackwood Cottage was small. It was a structure of dark stone and slate, nestled on the edge of a dense, dripping forest. There were no peacocks here, no manicured hedges, just wild ivy strangling the walls and a chimney puffing weak, grey smoke into the overcast sky. Hermione stumbled slightly upon landing, side-along apparition, with a passenger who had no magical core to stabilize. The transit was draining. Draco caught her. His hands steadied her by the waist, his reflexes faster than his pride. For a moment, they stood frozen in the overgrown garden. The silence here was different. It wasn't the dead silence of the archives, or the terrified silence of the courtroom. It was the organic, breathing silence of the earth. Draco let go of her slowly. He turned to look at the cottage. It was smaller than his bathroom at the manor. "Home's sweet prison," he murmured. The bitterness was there, but it was thin, overlaid with a profound, staggering relief. "It has a library," Hermione offered, feeling a sudden, absurd need to apologize for the accommodation. Small, but functional. Draco looked at her, a corner of his mouth twitching upward. "You checked the library before you agreed to the location?" "Priorities, Malfoy." "Draco," he corrected softly. "Just Draco now. The Malfoy part. I think the ministry took that too. He walked toward the heavy oak door. He reached for the handle, then stopped. He looked at his hand, then at the door. He couldn't open it. The wards. Hermione stepped up beside him. She raised her wand. "I have to key you in," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Give me your hand." He offered his right hand. She took it. His skin was freezing. She placed the tip of her wand against his palm. Admitto. A golden spark flared between their skin, sinking into his flesh. Draco hissed, his fingers curling around hers. The magic accepted him, not as a master, but as a resident, a guest. "You can enter," she said. He pushed the door open. Inside, the cottage was dim and smelled of pine and old wool. It was simple. A fireplace, a worn armchair, a wooden table. It was intimate, terrifyingly intimate. Draco walked to the center of the room and stopped. He looked at his hands again. 3 years, he whispered. No magic. No contact with the outside world. And no Azkaban, Hermione reminded him, closing the door and sealing out the wind. He turned to face her. The shadows of the room obscured his expression, making him look like a ghost in his own life. "Why did you do it, Hermione?" The question hung in the damp air. Hermione took off her cloak, shaking the water from it. She needed something to do with her hands. "I told the court why. Because it was just." "Bullshit," he said. The profanity was shocking coming from him. He stepped closer, entering her personal space. The energy in the room shifted, spiking from awkward to volatile. "You stood up in front of the entire wizarding world and incinerated your reputation for me. You lied to Runcorn. You manipulated the Wizengamot. That wasn't justice. That was something else." Hermione dropped the cloak on the chair. She looked up at him. He was right. It wasn't justice. It was selfishness. It was love. "I couldn't let them take you," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I couldn't let you rot in a cell. I would have burned the whole ministry down to get you out." Draco stared at her, his chest heaving. The realization of what she had sacrificed hit him anew. She was the Golden Girl, the future minister, and she had tainted herself irrevocably to save a former Death Eater. "You're stuck with me now," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're my probation officer. You have to visit me. You have to check on me. You have to watch me live this half-life. I know. I have nothing to offer you anymore," he pressed, his self-loathing bubbling to the surface. He spread his arms, gesturing to the small, dark room. "Look at me. I'm a pauper. I'm a convict. I can't even light a fire to keep you warm." Hermione watched him unravel. She saw the fear behind the anger. He was terrified that now, in the light of day, without the adrenaline of the chase, she would see him for what he was, broken and powerless, and leave him. She walked over to the fireplace. She pointed her wand at the logs. Incendio. The fire roared to life, casting a warm orange glow across the room. It banished the shadows. It illuminated the sharp angles of his face, the exhaustion etched into his features. She turned to him. She didn't holster her wand. She placed it on the mantelpiece, just out of reach. Then she walked to him. "I don't need you to light the fire, Draco," she said softly. "I can do that myself." She stopped inches from him. She reached out and took the lapels of his suit jacket, just as she had in her office, and pushed it off his shoulders. It fell to the floor with a heavy thud. "I don't need your gold," she continued, her hands moving to his tie, loosening the knot. And I certainly don't need your title. Draco stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard she could see the fabric of his shirt jump. He let her undress him, let her strip away the layers of his defense. "Then what do you need?" he choked out. Hermione pulled the tie free and dropped it. She unbuttoned the top button of his shirt, exposing the hollow of his throat. She pressed her palm against his skin, feeling the frantic pulse of his life force. "I need the person who understands the silence," she whispered. "I need the man who looked at me in the library and saw me, not the war hero. I need you." Draco let out a sound that was half sob, half groan. His resistance shattered. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into him with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. It wasn't the desperate, frantic embrace of the night before. This was different. This was grounding. This was gravity. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling deeply. "I am yours," he vowed into her curls. "I am entirely, wretchedly yours. For 3 years. For 10. Forever." Hermione closed her eyes, leaning into his warmth. The tension that had held her upright for months finally snapped. She slumped against him, letting him take her weight. "You're not a prisoner here, Draco," she murmured. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look her in the eyes. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs tracing the dark circles under her eyes. The firelight danced in his grey eyes, turning them into pools of liquid silver. "Aren't I?" he asked softly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, sad, knowing, and incredibly tender. "I can't leave, and I can't live without you. Sounds like a life sentence to me." "Is that a complaint?" "No," he whispered, leaning his forehead against hers. "It's a plea for mercy." He kissed her then. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was the kiss of a man who had nowhere else to be, and nowhere else he wanted to be. There was no urgency, only a deep, resounding confirmation. It tasted of the rain they had just escaped, and the fire that was now warming the room. Hermione responded with equal measure, her hands tangling in his hair, grounding him. In this small stone cottage, stripped of magic and status, the power dynamic finally dissolved. There was no judge and accused, no Gryffindor and Slytherin. There was just the silence. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the crackle of the fire, the sound of the rain on the roof, and the beat of 2 hearts that had finally found their rhythm. Draco broke the kiss, but didn't pull away. He held her close, his chin resting on her head, looking out at the darkened window. He saw his reflection in the glass, a man with no wand, no name, and an uncertain future. But he was holding the sun in his arms. "So," he whispered, his voice vibrating in his chest. "What happens now, probation officer?" Hermione smiled against his shirt. She could feel the heavy beat of his heart slowing, settling into peace. "Now," she said, looking up at him, her eyes bright and defiant, "we serve the sentence." Draco looked down at her. The shadows in his eyes receded, replaced by a fierce, quiet light. "Gladly," he said. Outside, the storm finally broke. The rain slowed to a gentle patter. The fog began to lift from the forest, revealing the first faint light of a moon struggling to break through the clouds. The verdict had been delivered. The case was closed. But inside the cottage, in the warmth of the firelight, the story, the real story, was just beginning. And for the first time in his life, Draco Malfoy wasn't afraid of the dark. He had the light right there in his arms.
Hello, friends. Thank you for listening to this story. I wanted to write something different today. This is not a story about war, this is a story about silence. In this story, Draco is not a villain. He is just a man who is tired. He wears a mask to protect himself, and Hermione, she is the only one who sees the truth behind that mask. I love the moment in the library. It shows that we all have fear and we all need kindness. The most important things here happen without words: a look, a touch, a glass of water. Love is not always loud, sometimes love is quiet. It is just two people sitting by a fire, saying from the rain. I hope you felt their emotion. I hope you felt the cold rain on the warm fire. Thank you for being here with me. See you in the next story.